I've just realized that we covered already chapter 31 of the book of Jeremiah, which is wonderful. Just like we see in the history of the house of Israel, there were those who were constantly rebelling against God and those who were always going contrary to His way. We see through the book of Jeremiah the same kind of phenomena is happening, and we have those false prophets who were preaching about peace and peace, just like the prophet Isaiah says, well, tell us smooth things, people would say, don't give us these bad things, and so on and so forth. In any case, you might have remembered that we often said how the church already, the New Testament church, right from its inception in the year 3133 before Christ, 3133 RH AD Anno Domini, so-called, the church was also infested with all kinds of heretics and all kinds of those who fell away later. And by the time, the commentaries would say that the original church, as Christ founded it and left it, was one kind of organization. And then all of a sudden, when we raised the curtain in the 2nd century, the same very church was something completely different. It was not even anything like the church in the 1st century. You might also remember that right there in the 2nd century, we had the continuation of the true church embodied through Polycarp of Smyrna, and the church era described as the church at Smyrna. Now I was thinking, history is the teacher of life. That's the saying in my language. History teaches us life. So I'm thinking that perhaps we need to be aware of some of those things that happened back then, because we see the same phenomenon here, dear brethren, here in our time and in our age. We see the Gnosticism. Gnosticism was a very kind of complex philosophy as well as doctrine in the 1st century, which originated in the 1st century. And Gnosticism as a doctrine, as philosophy, was already part of the crept into the church, through the individual church, and subverted it from within. You've heard me say that very often. So I was thinking that perhaps I should insert a little bit of historical background and knowledge about that. And I was thinking about giving you one example of such a behavior of Gnosticism. In Gnostic there is one person in the 3rd epistle of John called Diotrephes. So I thought about illustrating that today so that you can have an idea as to what happened to our brethren in the 1st century. Also you need to understand that the Simon Magus, who is the later founder of the Catholic Church, so founder of the agent of Satan, you might say, was actually, as he was rejected from the Apostolic Church, he started his first, shall we say work, or shall we say his first operation, trying to actually creep into the ranks of the true church. And then, of course, when he was rejected and he left it, and the subsequent history shows that he went to Rome and that he basically founded the Roman Catholic Church. Now, brethren, this is all perhaps important because when we have history being the teacher of our lives, it shows us once again, perhaps gives us the, shall we say, guidelines for our Christian lives today, and also to beware of some same forces today, or similar forces that might have evolved over the time. Because we live in a world when changes are very fast sometimes and sudden. But nevertheless, we live in this age where we have this ecumenical movement. And basically all of these factors in ecumenism, including the leading factor, which is the papacy, or popery, that leading factor all stems from Gnostic teachings and Gnostic ideas of the first century. So, having some background with this, I think would be very helpful, because then we can also understand how God has preserved us and how God continued His work through a small and persecuted church all the way to our time. So what about Gnosticism? Let's see about Gnosticism before we also take a look at one of the good examples of those Gnostics in the first century. Well, as I said, it's rather a complex religious movement. It's comprised basically of a myriad of sects, But nevertheless, just like today, we have in this Babylonian Christendom myriads of sects. But nevertheless, there is no reason for confusion when it comes to that very complex movement. Because there are 7 facts about Gnosticism that we need to keep in mind, brethren. And those 7 facts are very comforting, because it's not impossible to define Gnosticism. So the first fact that we need to keep in mind is that Gnosticism can be defined. The second one is that Gnosticism can also be classified, although there is no reason to waste our time on this very unnecessary process, because scholars waste much time on that, and scholars are just people who just waste much time on all kinds of things. So for us to kind of classify and go through all the various Gnostic aspects and classify them and so on, we're going to waste our time on that. The third fact is that Gnosticism is a pre-Christian, except for the doctrine of Christ's redemption. And Gnosticism existed before 30 AD in the Greek, Egyptian, and Babylonian world. The fourth fact is Gnosticism is a complete religious system. As a complete religious system, it began with Simon Magus, of whom I will still have to talk a few, down the road, because he is the founder of the Gnostic most famous institution even today, called Vatican. So Gnosticism as a complete religious system began with Simon Magus, when he syncretized, you might say that's the word, syncretized Babylonian Hellenic Gnosticism with his perverted form of Christianity. The fifth fact is that Gnosticism is not Jewish in origin, as various scholars think, but it is Samaritan, and that's something very important to keep in mind. The sixth fact is that Gnosticism was a distinct religion, but it did not stay outside of the church. Rather, it wormed its way into the church. And as I said, subsequently it just perverted the church from within, and completely perverted the church and turned it from the right track, into all kinds of wrong ways. Now the seventh fact we need to keep in mind is that Gnosticism developed in 3 stages, and the third stage had strong influence upon the Roman Catholic Church, which is today the leader of the ecumenical movement. So once again, those 7 facts: Gnosticism can be defined, it can also be classified, but we aren't going to waste our time on that. It's pre-Christian and existed in other cultures, in Greek, Egyptian, and Babylonian world. It's a complete religious system, which was formed finally as a complete with Simon Magus, who of course combined various other pagan ideas, with his perverted form of Christianity. Gnosticism is Samaritan, it's not Jewish. Gnosticism did not stay outside of the church, but wormed its way into the church. And Gnosticism, of course, had tremendous influence particularly upon the Roman Catholic Church. Now, we should not remain in confusion about Gnosticism, because the Bible gives us the clues we need to understand this new religion of knowledge, because the name of that religion comes from the word gnosis or knowledge, some kind of mystic knowledge that is only being revealed to those chosen. Now, beginning with Acts and Simon Magus, a Gnostic, and ending with Revelation, the Bible reveals Gnosis, falsely so called in 1 Timothy chapter 6 verse 20, which means a false religion using the name of Christ, but in actuality opposed to the true Christ. Please, brethren, notice that the word science in 1 Timothy chapter 6 verse 20, you'll find that word science in some translations. Let me see, I'm going to use, well, we've got various translations at hand nowadays, so that's something beautiful. Let me see which one I could use. Perhaps American Standard Version would be the good one to be used. Anyway. Okay, the Bible, open up yourself. Sometimes these machines, they're there to actually, American Standard Version? There is also English Standard Version. Yes. Okay, let me English Standard Version, and let's go to 1 Timothy 6:20. Speaking about chapter 6, speaks about the false teachers, of course, and they were just spreading the knowledge that seemed to be kind of wise knowledge, that seemed to be biblical knowledge. 1 Timothy 6:20, O Timothy, guard the deposit entrusted to you. Avoid the irrelevant babble and contradictions of what is falsely called, here is in English Standard Version, falsely called knowledge, or gnosis, exactly. So, this was the admonition given to young evangelist Timothy by the Apostle Paul. And so there is a false religion using the name of Christ, but it actually opposed to true Christ. And here in 1 Timothy 6:20, in the original Greek, the word knowledge is gnosis, or the word science is gnosis. And what is Gnosticism, brethren, you may wonder? Well, Dictionary of Christian Biography, Volume 2, article Gnosticism says, in logical order we ought to begin by defining Gnosticism, a point on which writers on the subject are not agreed. Then also in Biblical Theological and Ecclesiastical Cyclopedia, written by McClintock and Strong, Volume 3, article Gnosticism, it says, no question, however, has more perplexed historians than that which refers to the direct origin of Gnosticism. And yet, on the basis of the Bible, Gnosticism is easy to define. And let me give you that easy definition. A satanic religion of dualism, combining Oriental superstition with the Greek philosophy, denying God as creator and promising redemption, under quotation mark redemption, by special knowledge, gnosis, of the angelic or demon realm. So that's how you read, for example, in the book of Colossians about those who have this false cult of angels and so on. And that comes from Gnosticism. And in fact, if you don't know anything about Gnosticism, some parts of the New Testament you won't be able to understand. Now, how can the bewildering variety of Gnostic sects be classified? Let's touch upon that because we're not going to go into any deep details, but there is a labyrinthal maze of Gnostic systems and speculations. Dictionary of Christian Biography, volume 2, page 678. Speculations so wild and so baseless that it is irksome to read them and difficult to believe. That time was when acquaintance with them was counted as what alone deserved the name of knowledge under quotation mark. So in spite of the fact that there is a classification controversy in the academic circles, to Bible believers, those academic circles and their controversies are of no use. Gnosticism, brethren, being a religion of demons, is chaos. Being chaotic, Gnosticism could be classified from myriad points of view. However, to us, a couple of classifications might be helpful to grasp the satanic nature of Gnosticism. The first division is division of all sects into Judaistic versus anti-Judaistic, depending on their view of God, God's law, and the Old Testament. And then the other division is division of sects into ascetic versus licentious, meaning sexual profligacy. That's the division that was given to us by Clement of Alexandria anyway. So we have got ascetics, those who will just deny food, sleep, water, and enjoyment to the body, and then licentious, those who would just basically indulge into all kinds of fleshly activities, desires, and fleshly satisfactions and gratification. Now, you may wonder when and where did Gnosticism arise. We already mentioned it's not of Jewish origin, it's of Samaritan origin. So there was a pre-Christian Gnosticism first. So that answers the question when. Secondly, the earliest witnesses, if carefully analyze them, all agree that Gnosticism is not Jewish, but is Samaritan. And that tells us where. The best explanation of the pre-Christian gnosis is McClintock's and Strong's Biblical, Theological and Ecclesiastical Encyclopedia, Volume 3, article Gnosticism. Here is a quote from this publication. Ever since the conquest of Alexander the Great, an intense interest had been felt throughout Asia Minor and Egypt in Hellenistic philosophy and Oriental theosophy. And while the old mythological fables and professed systems of positive revelation had lost their authority, many thoughtful persons had discovered under these what they looked upon as a uniting bond of truth and the elements of universal religion. The result was that, near the time of the first promulgation of Christianity, a number of new systems of religious philosophy sprung up independently in different countries and exhibited similar characteristics. They were usually formed by incorporating with the national religion what seemed attractive elements in foreign systems and softening down what was harsh and incredible in the popular faith and worship. In this way, we discover a nearly simultaneous origin of the Judaistic philosophy of Alexandria, of Essenism and Therapeutism in Egypt and southern Palestine, or the Kabbalistic literature in Syria and the East, and of New Platonism among the Hellenistic nations. These were all offshoots from the same general root and not necessarily deriving anything original, but unquestionably drawing much assistance from one another. End of the quote. So, brethren, we see from this that, Satan laying a very good preparation for Christ's gospel. And he always does that because, Satan always tries to deceive, brethren. And if he cannot deceive, then he'll try to divide. Those are his two major tools, you might say, that he has been trying to employ from the Garden of Eden, from two trees. He divided God from, he made division between God and humankind, because he led the first humans to take fruits of the forbidden tree. And so whenever Satan does not succeed to divide, he just resorts to deceiving, or vice versa. If he cannot deceive, he can at least try to divide. That's perhaps why currently we are seeing all kinds of divisions in the body of Christ being divided up into various organizations and so on. But in any case, Satan was laying a very good preparation for Christ's gospel. God would not allow Satan to destroy the truth, that's for sure. But he did allow Satan to confuse and deceive, you see. Satan used his already established religions to prepare for Gnosticism. And Satan used Gnosticism as at least one major, if not the major infiltrators, or those who sabotaged the true original church. Now, going back to pre-Christian gnosis, we find that the Platonic doctrine of God, withdrawn entirely within himself, intelligible only to the initiated. We also find dualism and a fall of spirit beings. The Pythagorean doctrine, the Brahminic doctrine of emanation and hypostatizing of the divine attributes, the Parsic representation of God as light, of a dualism in which God is continually attacked by the world of matter, and the eternal conflict between good and evil, or darkness, and the Buddhist notions of a God in process of development and of souls longing to be freed from matter. Now, you see, in the Alexandrian literature, we find many of those elements, and it was basically diffused among the educated classes in all those countries in which Gnosticism flourished, and it might have been the mediating agency through which the mind of the East was brought into communication with that of the West. Now, there are two more authoritative sources which prove there was a pre-Christian Gnosis. The first one is Encyclopedia Britannica, 11th edition, volume 12, page 157. Thus, the essential part of most of the conceptions of what we call Gnosticism was already in existence and fully developed before the rise of Christianity. That's the quote from this Encyclopedia Britannica. Then, we have also History of Doctrines, written by Karl Rudolf Hagenbach, volume 1, page 54. It says, to the accounts given of Simon Magus, Meander and Dositheus, Simon's teacher, who have become almost mythical, at least prove that in Syria, Gnostic tendencies made their appearance at an early period. End of the quote. So once again, Gnosticism is Samaritan, it's not Jewish. That's very important, because Simon's doctrines were substantially those of the Gnostics, and he is not without reason regarded as the first who attempted to engraft theurgy and egotism of the Magian philosophy upon Christianity, informs us Biblical Encyclopedia, page 1591. Now, brethren, various scholars endeavor to prove that Gnosticism is Jewish. That's why I've already repeated twice that it's not. No, it's not Jewish, because Christian writer Hegesippus tells us that James the Just preached Jesus to 7 so-called Jewish sects, to Essenes, Galileans, Hemerobaptists, Masbotheans, also baptizers, Samaritans, Sadducees, and Pharisees. Before any further comment on Samaritans, brethren, let us even see one earlier authority, that of Justin Martyr. You've all heard of Justin Martyr. Now, Justin Martyr wrote his first apology at Rome, about 150 of our era. Now, Justin the Martyr was a Samaritan by birth, and his information is even earlier than the one that is provided by Hegesippus. And here it is, Justin Martyr, the first apology of Justin the Martyr, chapters 22 to 24. You can find that one in volume 1 of the Ante-Nicene Fathers. And thirdly, says Justin the Martyr, because after Christ's ascension in heaven, the devils put forward certain men who said that they themselves were gods, and they were not only persecuted by you, but even deemed worthy of honors. There was a Samaritan, Simon, a native of the village called Gitto, who in the reign of Claudius Caesar and in your royal city of Rome did mighty acts of magic by virtue of the art of the devils operating him. He was considered a god, and as a god was honored by you with a statue, which statue was erected on the river Tiber between the two bridges, and bore this inscription in the language of Rome. Simoni Dei Sancto, to Simon the Holy God. And all the Samaritans and a few even of other nations worshipped him and attacked him and acknowledged him as the first God. So this is from Justin the Martyr. So Simon Magus was, brethren, even considered to be a god. Now the historical context of Justin shows that he deems Simon to be the first Gnostic, and at least Justin mentions him first. And yes, many other people believe that Simon Magus, who appears in the Bible in the book of Acts, was the father of Gnosticism. You see, the third earliest Catholic authority as the origin of Gnosticism is Irenaeus, scholar Irenaeus. In his work Against Heresies, he ascribes the oldest Gnostic system to Simon Magus from Samaria, Menander, and Saturnius. Now Robert M. Grant, in the book Gnosticism and Early Christianity, page 70, underlines this following fact, and that fact of heretics Magus, Menander, and Saturnius. He says, my account of the development of Gnosticism has to be concerned with the person and doctrine of Simon Magus. Now, one modern scholar insists against the Jewish theory, or that Gnosticism has originated from Judaism or from Jewish people. Hans Jonas, he says there are no early Hebrew Gnostic writings. There is only one Jewish name in early Gnosticism, and that name is Simon. But neither had it ultimate origin in Judaism, for from the strong heathen philosophy, Gnosticism underwent many modifications and accommodations. Now, Gnosticism's real origin, in spite of many erroneous claims that it is an offshoot of Judaism, no, it is of Samaritan origin. What relation did Gnosticism have then with Judaism? Well, this same author Jonas answers. The nature of the relation of Gnosticism to Judaism in itself is undeniable fact, is defined by anti-Jewish animus spirit with which it is saturated. End of the quote. Now, Hegesippus gives a list of those sects that were influenced by Gnosticism, and he mentions Samaritans among those people and among those sects, and supposed Jewish desire for gnosis that eventually led to the origin of Gnosticism is refuted by Jonas, because he says that the Jewish Orthodox gnosis of itself just cannot lead to something basically different from itself. Somebody must have taken it and made it into something new, turned it upside down. Who was the one who did so? Well, Jonas shows that Jews would hardly have attacked their own tradition, their own people, their own religion, or so fiercely as did Gnosticism. He asks if it might be Simon the magician from Samaria, who is, as it happens, the earliest of them all. So, again, it was believed, you see already, that Simon and his followers, we might say, they were the earliest of all of the Gnostics in the world, indeed. Now, we must not forget that Simon was the member of a very special placed community, a group discriminated against, rejected, despised. Here we have a palpable motive for a response of resentment, aggression, and spite. And here, for once, we can connect a definite meaning with much invoked, hazy term, fringes or outskirts of Judaism, at which we are told Gnosticism originated, a term that usually prompts me to ask, inside or outside the line. The Samaritans were partly in and partly out, and some of them apparently were very far out. Well, we see what is meant by vague fringes of Judaism. It's a term, brethren, used by some scholars to describe the origin of Gnosticism. Now, it really is Samaria, The church history and church tradition tells us that Gnosticism came into being as a religion first through Simon Magus. Now Simon had plenty of Babylonian and Persian material to work with in Samaria. So it's not strange, for Babylonian mysteries to be in Syria and Samaria. The Samaritans were a hybrid race originally from Babylon and from Persia, as you can find in 2 Kings chapter 17 and in Ezra chapter 4. The Babylonian customs and religions were imported from Babylonia and Syria to Rome. Babylon had funneled much of its racial stock, and so its ideas to Syria and later to Rome. So therefore Gnosticism is, pre-Christian to its preparation, and Simon Magus is its foundation. Now why Gnosticism? Well, brethren, why or for what purpose did Satan devise Gnosticism? We should remember that what Satan cannot destroy, he must confuse or capture, you see. Now, Gnosticism intended to become a universal religion. That's exactly what the word Catholicus means universal. That's what Gnosticism was aspiring to be. And intended to become a universal religion. Evidence is so abundant that even though Gnosticism had a syncretic, which means hybrid religions, background, it nevertheless was, as Hans Jonas said, a religion of its own. Gnosticism was an intentional deviation from the truth, from orthodoxy. And Neander says in his Church History, volume 2, page 30, when these Gnostics, with their system already made, looked into the New Testament, they could easily find in it their new religion, all there, since they only sought for points to which they might attach it. And also, this another famous author, Adolf Harnack, in his History of Dogma, page 60, describes that the Gnostics undertook to set forth Christianity as the absolute religion, and they therefore placed it in opposition to other religions, to that of the Old Testament as well, not alone to Judaism, but the absolute religion which they coupled with Christ was to them essentially identical with the results of the philosophy of doctrine, for which they had now found the basis in a revelation. They were accordingly a class of Christians who essayed through a sharp onset to conquer Christianity by Hellenic culture and Hellenic culture of Christianity. Now, Charles William King wrote the book The Gnostics and Their Remains, and then page 9, he says the later Gnosticism is in fact a chieflet, as well expressed it, the spirit of Asiatic antiquity, seeking to assert its empire over the soul of man by insinuating itself into the Christian church. This is from Charles William King, The Gnostics and Their Remains, page 9. So Gnosticism had two goals, brethren: to pervert, confound, and confuse the true church, if possible, of course, and bring more error into the church, into the Catholic Church, as at a later date. So now we have this interesting fact laid bare before our eyes, so we can think about it, because armed with their deliberate perversions of Old Testament scriptures, which Jonas calls the anti-Semitic animus, and then fully intending to pervert Christianity according to Satan's plan, then they warmed into the church. These Gnostics, for the most part, had no intention of separating from the rest of the church and establishing distinct communities of their own. They were for uniting with the ordinary congregations and establishing in connection with them a kind of theosophic school of Christian mysteries. This is what was stated to us behind the Endless Church History, Volume 2, page 33. Now, one other important fact about the Gnosticism must not be overlooked, friends. The German scholar Lipsius, who wrote Gnosticism, its origin and development in 1860. So, the German scholar development of Gnosticism is similar to a curve which began only slightly off from the truth, diverged far out, and finally returned closely to the Catholic Church. And this was the pattern, brethren, that followed basically the Church throughout the ages. In the last century, the pattern was again true. First, it starts like a curve. It looks only to be slightly off of the track, slightly off from the truth. Then it diverged far out, and finally returned closely to this mainstream ecumenical Christianity. I mean, those who made up the church in the last century, many of them ended up just like that. Many of them ended up being scattered everywhere, and some have dropped even their attendance altogether. In McClintock and Strong's Encyclopedia and in Dictionary of Christian Biography, Volume 2, page 602, we read that finally under the Marcionites, the Gnostic speculation approximates very nearly that of the more liberal Catholic teachers. End of the quote. So, again, this is a historical background that could help you, be very helpful, brethren, that you would understand the development, the power, and the fact that Gnosticism crept in unawares into the church and then spread very quickly, rapidly its own influence. Now that resulted in various people, faithful servants, being basically kicked out and being removed from the church. For example, with the young evangelist Timothy, we later don't find any records of him. So it seems that from the visible organized church, he was basically removed, he and those who were faithful with him. And we have no idea what would be his further activities anyway, because the Bible history doesn't tell us about it. However, the Bible itself speaks about a man called Diotrephes. He's mentioned in 3 John, and I said I'm going to use him as a good example of a person that fights against God and does that by using his position and trying and removing from the church of faithful members of the church. 3 John, and it has only one chapter, of course. Let's first review once again, review some things, historical things. You see, brethren, the 3 John is the shortest book in the Bible, but it has a very powerful message for us today. It was written in the late 90s AD by the aged Apostle Paul, so it's his letters to the elect lady and Gaius, which we call 2 John and 3 John. They contain relevant warning for us. Why? Because, as I mentioned, the last first century AD was a time of doctrinal departure from the truth, and many, if not most, had already apostatized and given up the faith once delivered for a false counterfeit Christianity. John lived on into this degenerate period. He was grateful for the few who were still holding steadfast against the liberal tide of the day. John warned the faithful to keep on serving the brethren and to be on guard against selfish apostates who loved to lord it over their brethren and casting them out of the church. So, in 3 John, chapter 1, verse 1, the elder to the beloved Gaius, whom I love in truth. Beloved, I pray that all may go well with you, and that you may be in good health, and it goes well with your soul. For I rejoiced greatly when the brothers came and testified of your truth, as indeed you are walking in the truth. I have no greater joy than to hear that my children are walking in the truth. Beloved, it is a, verse 5, faithful thing you do in all your efforts, these brothers, strangers as they are, who testify to your love before the church. You will do well to send them on their journey in a manner worthy of God. For they have gone out for the sake of the name, accepting nothing from the Gentiles. Therefore we ought to support people like this, that we may be fellow workers for the truth. I have written something to the church, but Diotrephes, who likes to put himself first, does not acknowledge our authority. Here is this Diotrephes. So if I come, I'll bring up what is he doing, talking wicked nonsense against us. And not content with that, he refuses to welcome the brothers and also stops those who want to and puts them out of the church. Now, beloved, do not imitate evil, but imitate good. Whoever does good is from God. Whoever does evil has not seen God. Demetrius has received a good testimony from everyone and from the truth itself. We also add our testimony, and you know that our testimony is true. So once again, we have this collision, truth and error, lies and truth, very interesting. Now, what else do we know from the church history, brethren? Well, according to ecclesiastical history, it claims that John, after the death of Emperor Domitian in AD 95, returned from his exile on the Isle of Patmos to Ephesus. Then John went on, let's call it evangelical tours into the Gentile regions, visiting the churches of Asia and ordaining bishops and elders. In 2 John 12 and in 3 John chapter verse 10. So in John 12 and in 3 John 10, in verse 14 speaks of John's visitation trips, and thus it appears that these letters at the last written portions of the Holy Scriptures, they are living letters for the hard times of spiritual depression which we have experienced in the 90s, or at least that some of us have experienced in the 90s of the last century, and which we may still experience ahead of us, particularly in the time shortly before the flight to the place of safety. Now, 2 John is addressed to the elect lady and her children, as you see in verse 1. With John were the children of the elect sister, in verse 13 of John 2, And commentaries mention that lady may actually refer to a church or the proper name, or it was a proper name of the woman. The Greek Kyriaki or Kyria is equivalent to the Hebrew for Martha. Kyria or Kyrios means belonging to the Lord, and is the source of Kyrios, the word for church, you see. Now 3 John it's addressed to Gaius. Now he may have been Gaius of Macedonia, traveling companion of Paul, which is mentioned in Acts 19 verse 29. Which says, so the whole city was filled with confusion and rushed into the theater with one accord, having seized Gaius and Aristarchus, Macedonians, Paul's travel companions, then Gaius, of course, baptized by Paul, and his post in Romans 16:23 and 1 Corinthians 1:14. Goes to 1 Corinthians 1:14. Gaius is mentioned there. Gaius, my host and the host of the whole church, greets you. And something else, he says, I thank God that I baptized none of you except Crispus and Gaius. Now, here we see some, again, historical background, brethren. And it might be Gaius of Derbe, who went with Paul from Corinth on his last trip to Jerusalem about 57 AD, or he may have been another Gaius. Regardless, the Gaius is commended for his faithfulness. Now, another faithful believer is Demetrius. 3 John, you find him in 3 John and in verse 11 and 12. Let us read about him. No, this is the wrong. We are so now, let's see. Oh, I'm having this. Let's see, 2 John. This will be 2 John, right? We should be speaking of Gaius now, but my Bible is not behaving well. 2 John, and we said that we are going to read in, let me see, the notes have been now the third, no, 2 John, yes, so 2 John is verse 1, it's addressed to the elect lady and her children. And then in verse 13 we find, with John, were the children of thy elder elect sister. Now again, the commentaries, as I said, mentioned, this might be really a church, because the woman is a symbol of the church in the Bible, or it could be even the name of a woman anyway. Now, Kyria in Greek means, Kyrios is the word for the church. Now the 3 John is Gaius, addressed to Gaius or Caius, with C, with G, Gaius or Caius with C. So let's see the 3 John, which says right there in the introduction, the elder to the beloved, his English Standard Version says Gaius, whom I love in truth. And then of course you see, I pray that all may go well with you and that you may be in good health. So that's what we always pray for one another, as it goes well with your soul. So there is nothing to pray that all goes well with our souls as well. So who was this Gaius? Well, perhaps this was a man from Macedonia, because Paul had a traveling companion called Gaius of Macedonia. If you go to Acts chapter 19, verse 29, you can see this companion. Acts 19:29. So the whole city, having seized Gaius and Aristarchus, Macedonians, Paul's travels companions, this is what they're mentioned. Also there was a Gaius at Corinth, who was baptized by Paul and by his host. in Romans 16:23, and here's one in 1 Corinthians 1, chapter 1, verse 14. It mentions Gaius, my host, and the host of the whole church greets you. And then he says, I thank God that I baptized none of you except Crispus and Gaius. And there is another Gaius of Derbe, and he went with Paul from Corinth on his last trip to Jerusalem about 57 AD, or it might be totally different Gaius, another Gaius. Regardless, brethren, the Gaius is commended, obviously, in this letter, and obviously by his good works. He is commended for his faithfulness. Faithfulness, and there is another faithful believer who is mentioned in 3 John in verse 11 and 12. It's Demetrius. So verse 11 and 12, here is Demetrius now. Beloved, do not imitate evil, but imitate good. Whoever does good is from God. Whoever does evil has not seen God. Demetrius has received a good testimony from everyone and from the truth itself. We also add our testimony, and you know that our testimony is true. So we have the true believers commended for their faithfulness, and Gaius is one of them. So, who that Gaius might be, it could be a matter of thinking, I would not say even debate. But anyway, in a time of spiritual decay, the elect lady and her sister, their children, Gaius and Demetrius, were among the few who had not followed false doctrine, brethren. That's for sure. And John knew his life was nearing an end. He was just released from Patmos. He was now in Ephesus. His last years were in Ephesus. He's an interesting character, because you notice that for example, his gospel is totally different from the gospel of the three. In which way different? Different in the way that there are certain accounts we find in his gospel that are not found in other three gospels. For example, Jesus Christ and his talk with a Samaritan woman at Samaritan village at the well is only mentioned, for example, in the Gospel of John. John also puts much emphasis in his account on Samaritans and Samaria. You may wonder why. Well, because again, Samaritans were always being like a rival people to the Jews. That's why the woman was so shocked, You're a Jew and you're talking to me, a Samaritan woman, and you're asking me to give you water. And then, of course, she understands at the end when Jesus Christ tells her about certain facts of her biography, she understands that he must be the Messiah. And then she goes to the whole village, and the whole village, believes and accepts Jesus as the Messiah. Well, so the Apostle John was actually giving certain facts, and he was basically fighting against Samaritans and their Samaritan doctrinal errors, like the error that it's that their father is Jacob, and the woman says to Jesus Christ, our father is Jacob, and we pray here at this mountain as our father Jacob has said. And then Jesus Christ says, well, the time is coming when the true believers will pray in the Spirit and the truth. So he's putting particular emphasis on Samaritans, you see, and since Gnosticism originates with Samaria, he is basically fighting Gnosticism in all of his epistles, in all the three epistles, including his gospel. Now his gospel brings us some different aspects, not mentioned in the other three gospels. Why? Because John was writing his gospel toward the end of the first century, brethren. And toward the end of the first century, unlike the other three gospel writers, John, now the author, is defending the true faith that was once for all delivered to the saints. Why is he doing that? Because by the end of his life, he has already seen how the Gnostic, how shall we call it, conspiracy, let's call it conspiracy, how the Gnostic conspiracy crept into the church and was already subverting from within. And, that's why he expresses his joy here that, there's still some children, like Demetrius and Gaius, who are still faithful to the true doctrine and have not followed the false doctrines of Gnosticism. The false doctrines of Gnosticism, whose main leader at that time was already Simon Magus. Simon Magus, who succeeded actually to found the universal so-called Christian church and spread it all over the world. And those are the facts that we need to be aware of, because, brethren, the deception is still very strong. I remember it will be sometimes in 2013, I think. 2013, and by that time I came up with a booklet in Serbian language about the where did the apostles go and how did they end their lives. And I remember that I also had a section on Simon Magus and his false church that he founded. Interestingly enough, almost a week after my sermon in Serbian, which I recorded and spread around that time, for the first time in the history, following a mass at Vatican, the Pope took the remains, or bodily remains, of course. What was the name of that in English language? But anyway, bodily remains of so-called Saint Peter, and showed them to the believers. This never happened before. Now, of course, he took it because under the main altar in Vatican there is supposedly the tomb of Saint Peter. Brethren, Saint Peter never even went to Rome, let alone that he is being buried in Rome. Now, of course, those remains were not of Saint Peter. Those remains were of Simon Magus, brethren. And you need to know that, brethren. You need to understand that. You need to know how high and deep deception is. Just like now, as I'm telling you, as I told you, it's the World Cup at this time that I'm telling you all of this, and the Croatia-Morocco. Croatian masses are now on the streets, kneeling in a total fervor, religious fervor. They're praying fervently to Virgin Mary, so-called Virgin Mary, because she was not virgin till the end of her life, praying to Mary that they may win. Brethren, again, the deception, as Satan is the author of all deception in all spheres of life, including religion, is very high. The deception about the church history is tremendous. The secular history is being falsified anyway, by various people, the secular history. But nevertheless, the falsification of the true religion is absolutely stunning. It is so stunning, and we need to understand what we are continuation of. We're continuation of the small persecuted church. We're just a few out of humankind who have not fallen for the false religion. We're just a few who have not fallen for corruption, because along with the false religion usually came corruption. What is the most corrupted institution today on the face of the earth? If you all will just point to your finger to Vatican and say Vatican, yes, you would be right. Usually with perversion of doctrines comes perversion of character as well. And I've seen that also back in 1995 when almost overnight, I've seen the perversion of character of my fellow students and ambassador who are willing, for the sake of their own advantage and advancing in the church, they're willing to turn in until yesterday their friends, just for the sake of their own advantage and advancement. They were willing to turn in those friends who were not in accordance with the so-called changes, with the heresies being promulgated into the church of God. And always with doctrinal errors, always comes this, I've seen it with my own eyes, always comes the bribes, corruption, doctrinal errors, apostasy, you name it. And it's all, under the cloak of Christianity, true Christianity. I've seen it with my own eyes back in 1995, brethren. It's not we cannot rule out that things like that may not happen even in our times. Sadly, yes. Because you see, these fallings away from the truth, these apostasies, these departures from the truth, they have followed the true church ever since its inception. Ever since Simon Magus, you might say. And we will speak about Simon Magus a bit more, because yes, we need to understand some aspects and lessons we can learn from the history of the true church, and lessons that we can learn from history, because history is a teacher of life. And in a time of spiritual decay, there are few. Very often in the church history, there are few who did not follow the false doctrine. And there is a great importance of doctrinal truth. And that's why we need to strive to preserve always and fight for the doctrines that was already once for all given to the saints. And again, I'm going now back to John. So John had already seen what was going on in the true church. His life was nearing the end. He had faithfully taken care of Jesus' mother Mary. And there was history tells us that he took her to France among the Gaul people. That he had been also exiled on the Isle of Patmos by Emperor Domitian, where Victorinus says that John had to labor in the mines of Patmos. He had returned to Ephesus and was involved in shoring up the faith of the faithful few who remained steadfast in the truth. And he had already seen what the Gnosticism had done to the true church. And that's why, brethren, in his gospel that was written towards the end of the first century, as well as in his epistles, John emphasizes the importance of doctrinal truth. Doctrinal truth, doctrinal truth. In his second epistle, second letter, he rejoices to know of even a few who are faithful to the truth, because, as Revised Standard Version says, because of the truth which abides in us and will be with us forever. So John is saying nothing can take the truth from us, because it lives in us by the Spirit of the Savior, the Messiah. The one who was denied, of course, by Gnostic teachings, because you are redeemed and saved basically by the secret, special knowledge, gnosis, that is revealed to those chosen few. You see, that's another, yes, there are few are chosen, many are called, few are chosen, brethren, but you see how Satan subverts the truth. And so do people who just serve Satan, whether they're nominal Christians or those who sometimes creep in unawares, as it says. Into the true church, like Gnosticism did, and it just looked like the true church. Many people accepted it and then became a majority in the visible organized church and pushed out those few believers out of their churches. Not Emperor Domitian's persecution, not apostasy by many, not false brethren following false doctrines, brethren, nothing can take that truth from us. So no persecution by the authorities, no apostasy by many, not false brethren following false doctrines, nothing can take the truth from us, and keep that also in mind. We all must follow the Eternal's commandments, we must follow the way of love. Now what is that way? It is the Messiah. Many then and many today, such as New Age movement, for example, many people then and many today say that Jesus was just a good man. That's what they would say as much, but not God, not divine, not our Master, not the Lord. Brethren, this is the spirit of Antichrist. The way of love is shown in how we love the brethren. That is the primary doctrinal truth that John wanted to hammer home before he died. That's why he says, 2 John verse 9. This is New International Version, which I rarely quote, but sometimes it's merited to be quoted. Anyone who runs ahead instead of follows behind. You see, anyone who runs ahead and does not continue in the teaching of Christ does not have God. Whoever continues in the teaching has both the Father and the Son. So they place themselves ahead of God, you see, brethren. They're a God unto themselves. They don't need Jesus Christ to return to judge the brethren because they judge the brethren themselves. This is the primary warning John gives in both his second and third letter. Those who depart, brethren, from the doctrine and attempt to come into your house, you are not to receive, not even bidding them Godspeed, says the 2 John verse 10 and 11. If anyone comes to you and does not bring this doctrine, do not receive him into your whole house, nor greet him, for he who greets him shares in his evil deeds. And then 3 John continues John's final admonition for us to follow the way of love and truth. He wishes that Gaius would be in physical health, as he was spiritually healthy, and apparently John knew of a health problem of Gaius. He knew Gaius was rock solid in the truth, and wished him physical health to match. It almost sounds like Gaius, like John, was an old warrior in the faith, and maybe was battle weary. And as I said this now, my friend comes to mind. Our deacon, Richard Close, who was an old warrior in the faith, but he was not battle weary. That man, what a wonderful in energy, what a wonderful example, and how dearly I miss him indeed. Now, in spite of any physical problems, or possibly even old age, Gaius was a tireless servant of the Master. An example to follow, just like our Richard Close was a wonderful example to follow. Traveling brethren were being served well by Gaius. Some of them had told John of his love and friendship. These evangelist travelers had accepted nothing from the Gentiles for ministering to them. That's why in 3 John verse 8, this is amplified version, so we ourselves ought to support such people, to welcome and provide for them in order that they may be fellow workers in the truth, meaning the whole gospel, and cooperate with its teachers. Now there are of course few of those teachers, because few people remain faithful to the truth. Every person in the church should be doing something to support the work of the faithful few, brethren. Something, of course. Now, hearing reports of faithful brothers such as Gaius gave John great joy. 3 John chapter verse 3, again the amplified version. I have no greater joy than this, to hear that my spiritual, of course, children, my spiritual children are living their lives in the truth. How beautifully put. But realizing the context and time when John wrote this, it is utterly amazing to note his boundless optimism, his vigor for the hard work in the Almighty's cause. There was plenty of reason for gloom and depression because of all the false doctrine, false teachers, and persecution of the true believers. Perhaps John knew that those 2 letters would be his last recorded testimony. He doesn't hammer home the importance of keeping the Sabbath, the importance of keeping the Passover, holidays, tithing, etc. We know he kept these and all the commandments of God because of the testimony of his disciple Polycarp, Bishop of Smyrna. But John gets right to the heart of the matter and gives a valedictory, if you want, message for all time. The important thing John stresses in both his second and third letters is service to others, brethren. Service to others. Put others first, serve the brethren, love the brethren, hold on to the doctrinal truths. Now you can well just imagine that people like Diotrephes were just all the opposite. Would Diotrephes put others first? Would he serve the brethren, love the brethren, hold on to the doctrinal truths? No, it is all the opposite. And don't knuckle under and become like the false brethren who twist the truth and who may even put you out of the church. That's what John has hammered had hammered in his second and third epistle. And then, of course, we have those who put themselves first. Those who are all important in their own eyes. Let's talk about them a little bit, and this will be like the first installment, and we can continue next Sabbath. So there is another group associated with the church. John doesn't lambast them, but he cannot ignore them either, brethren. These are they who have lost the things John and others worked to build in their lives. 2 John, and this would be verse 8. Look to yourselves that we do not lose those things we worked for, but that we may receive a full reward. When you read this, does this possibly invoke in you another scripture? Wasn't it Jesus Christ who tells the Philadelphian remnant in this Laodicean age to look to themselves, not to lose things they worked for, that they may receive a full reward, that is, that they may not lose their crown. Isn't that what Christ says? Yes, that's exactly what he says. But there are those who put themselves first. They are deceivers who do not believe in the Godhood of Christ and have not stayed in the doctrine. Look at verse 7. We're in 2 John, verse 7. For many deceivers have gone out in the world who do not confess Jesus Christ as coming in the flesh. This is a deceiver and an antichrist. For many deceivers have gone out into the world who do not confess Jesus Christ as coming in the flesh. This is a deceiver and an antichrist. Verse 9. Whoever transgresses and does not abide in the doctrine of Christ does not have God. He who abides in the doctrine of Christ has both the Father and the Son. So you see, brethren, they have departed from the true doctrines. They have departed from the true doctrines. They refuse to assist faithful, traveling, evangelizing brethren who are keeping the truth alive. When one reads about the many cases in the New Testament church of false teachers and false brethren, it's easy to get a wrong impression that these false prophets had thrown everything out and had gone back to the world, brethren. We would love to think that way. We would hope that that would be the case, but that was not the case. Nothing could be further from the truth. The apostate church, later turned Catholic or universal, claimed to be Christian, had a form of godliness, but denied the power thereof. In John's day, this other group was dominant. They were in control of most of the public assemblies of brethren. One assembly near Gaius was led by a man named Diotrephes. His name in Greek means nourished by Zeus. Zeus being the supreme deity in both the Roman and the Greek world. Nothing more is known of Diotrephes than John's reproof of him in 3 John verse 9 and 10. And let's read that one and then stop here, and then before we can continue next week. So what we have is this, 3 John verse 9 and 10. I have written briefly to the church, but Diotrephes, who likes to take the lead among them and put himself first, does not acknowledge my authority and refuses my suggestions or to listen to me. How incredible, brethren, before I continue to read this, how incredible you think. As far as I understand the Bible, here is John, the last apostle who was alive. As far as if I understood properly, he was cousin to Jesus Christ because his mother was the sister of Jesus Christ's mother. Here we have the apostle, last living apostle, faithful apostle, cousin of Jesus Christ, and you have this Diotrephes, this nourished by Zeus, who puts himself first and does not acknowledge the authority and refuses suggestions of Christ's cousin. Unbelievable, brethren. What an audacity, what an egoism, what a self-centeredness, incredible. So when I arrive, John says, I'll call attention to what he's doing. He's boiling over and casting malicious reflections upon us with insinuating language, and not satisfied with that, he refuses to receive and welcome the brethren himself, and also interferes with and forbids those who would welcome them, and tries to expel or excommunicate them from the church. I've read this from Amplified Version, by the way. From the church. Excommunicate them from the church. Incredible. So those who are true believers, those who are true evangelists, those who are true members, faithful to the doctrine, true doctrine, people who have obviously a good standing, you might say, who have a character who is right, faithful. Here we have this nourished by Zeus, who tries to expel or excommunicate them from the church. Absolutely amazing. So let's stop here, and then we can continue with this bad knowledge, with this good knowledge actually of this bad person. We can continue next Sabbath to analyze this example of one of those apostates who was apostate in the first century when Gnosticism, the philosophy, a doctrine which was a philosophy and a doctrine which Gnosticism, when that perverted philosophy and perverted doctrine took over the true church and subverted it from within.